the pre-show of the NGE Shadowverse Open number 7. Number 7.
That's right. It's been a whole week since week 6, obviously, because it's week 7. Sterling, stating the obvious for you.
Hey, no. Well, sometimes, what if it wasn't a week? What if it was week 6 and then week 7 was just a week, not just a week apart, but 2 weeks apart?
Could be.
Entirely possible. Entirely possible. But a new week, and Sterling was absolutely right. 1 week since number 6. And that means that we have a new guest. Our special guest today is the one and only Excelsior Vindy. Vindy, how are you doing today?
Hi. I'm doing well, except I was... yeah. Hello.
Hey. Excelsior Vindy, of course, the organizer for the EXG tournaments, as well as kind of the person who headed up Team EXG, who we see a lot of players from competing in the NGE Shadowverse Open. Looking forward to seeing how they do today. But before we do that, I'd love to just have Vindy join us here and talk a little bit about the Shadowverse competitive space in general, teeing off, of course, always, the JCG. Now, the first place finisher of the Saturday JCG tournament is Blan, and the second place finisher is Esho. Not really sure how you pronounce that, but Esho.
Okay.
And both of them were using Dragon and Shadowcraft decks.
Great.
Nothing too extraordinary. Look through their deck list. It seemed either Storm Dragon or Sahak Will Ramp kind of thing. And
Cool.
Shadow was mostly mid-range. There wasn't too much different about that. And then on Sunday, the first place winner was Takada. And the second place winner was Oji-san. So those were the two players there. Dragon Shadow taking first place by Takada, and Oji-san had a Shadowcraft Havencraft deck. So the trend kind of continues for JCG. Now, I don't know if there's anything particularly special to say about the JCG this week. The trend continues is definitely the focus point here. When looking at the deck usage rates, things like Force, things like Swords, things like Rune, almost entirely from the duration between the qualification stages and the playoff stages got weeded out entirely. And that was the same for Saturday and Sunday.
Right.
The most interesting thing to note is Havencraft is actually seeing a positive win rate, where their percentage share of deck kind of space is increased between the qualifiers and the playoffs, meaning that more of those decks are winning out and maintaining. So that's kind of interesting to note. I'm more curious, Vindy, how you feel this compares to the Western scene. I know you do a lot of tournaments week after week. What have you been seeing over in the EXG tournaments?
So, some of the... usually the correlation between JCG and Western is that if they do well with something, we're going to see more of in EXG tournaments. For example, Haven class has been rising a lot recently, and they're coming out with either Storm or Altercation of Aegis Haven, or weird hybrid of sorts. And recently, last week, we had, I believe, 2 to 3 Haven making camp coming out, and then, yeah, usually that's the correlation of it. As for Shadows and Dragons, I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon.
Right.
Except for maybe some funny decks.
Well, tell us about that, because particularly in last week's EXG tournaments, there were quite a few particularly interesting Shadowcraft decks that actually made it through. What were those?
One of them was actually a NEP deck that made it through, which was last weekend, and I believe that particular deck won.
Was it running Death's Ledger?
Yes, it was. It was running Lyrials, Attendant of Knights, Foul Tempest, packed 3 Death Ledgers, Death Breaths, Kawis, and Mordecai's and Nephthys. No Hector in this one, but Kawi, I can understand why it could be significant, especially if it runs against Dragons of Swords. But it's also pretty interesting here too that Foul Tempest is part of this, mainly to, of course, clear as many as they can. We don't really see a lot of Nephthys in EXG tournaments, but
Neither do we.
lately they've been coming around.
Yeah, it certainly seems like players are trying to branch out and experiment a little more. And Nephthys was one of those decks that people got. There was a real big scare, right? Because when things like Lightning Blast came down, and of course Ector in many ways and is currently kind of, if you will, overshadowing the deck. Oh, I'm sorry. That hurt you. That emotionally hurt you.
I'm just gonna go.
Please don't go. Stay, please. But in many ways, that this New Age mid-range Catacomb Reaper Ector deck is kind of overpowering the Nephthys decks, which was, I feel like, the go-to Shadowcraft archetype to play in Rage of Bahamut. And now there's this curious resurgence of it. Do you feel like we'll see any of that today in the Shadowverse Open? Do you feel like you'll see that in the next EXG tournament, Vindy?
I feel like I don't think so much in the 2-deck format, because the one thing that comes to mind is you gotta go fast. So, but the Nephthys deck, it's a little bit slower. So since there is a 3-deck 1-ban system, people tend to ban out whatever their fastest deck and play a little slower, encountering dragons or mid-range swords of swords.
And what's
those are
interesting
the
about
2 remaining.
What's interesting about Death's Ledger is that you can't really run Skull Beast or Sergeants in the deck, because Ledger, when you play it, it will summon any Shadowcraft follower that costs less than your current amount of play points. So it could,
Exactly.
if you have Skull Beast in your deck, it could summon that and destroy it, and you gain 2 shadows. But which is why you have the Lyrial and the Grimnirs and Unicas to kind of just like give tempo, neutral followers to give tempo in that early stage, and then Attendant of Night, maybe even Hell's Unleasher, as your first like Shadowcraft followers that are guaranteed to be summoned by Death's Ledger.
So lots of things to think about in terms of running a Nephthys Death Ledger deck. But you also mentioned that there was another interesting kind of archetype of Shadow. I don't know if this was featured in tournaments or if it was just something you saw in play in general. But the card Minth. Tell us a little bit about this card for those who don't know what it is, and tell us what has fascinated you about this card.
So, Minthy decks is basically just a 3/4 stats, and the fanfare generally says that your necromancy effect costs 0 until this follower leaves the field or area. So it works on cards that requires shadow or necromancy, and the goal of Minty decks is to bring in Tyrant, which is a 6-drop creature with the stats of 3/3. And what that fanfare says is, if it utilizes 20 shadows, and when it gets 20 shadow, it super buffs it to a whopping 13/13. You can evo it, of course, to do 15/15, and usually, you just need to chip in 5 damage and then you win. But the thing with this is, the cons of it is that it's slow. It takes turn 10. You gotta play Minty first, and then the Tyrant. Sorry. And then, but eventually, you have to protect yourself until then. But the thing is, you don't really need to protect yourself too much, because you run the core Catacomb plus smaller minions plus Shadow Reapers to do that for you. So it's just like an alternative win to the Hector Shadow Reaper.
So typically where maybe a mid-range Shadow deck would go for face, trying to get as much damage as possible to try to end the game sooner, it can kind of take its time and maybe go for more board clear instead. Still probably getting that at least 5 damage and saving an evolve point for a Tyrant. But it's still a pretty risky play, because you have to get all the way to turn 10, and you have to hope that they don't throw a ward down. And if they do, maybe you have the evolve point for Mithy to take down the ward or something. There's a lot of things that could go wrong with the strategy.
Well, what I notice is that not too many class are running a whole lot of wards aside Shadow, who runs Death Breath of sorts. Dragons have just Grimnir and Rahab, and in general, Rahab would play early on, and sometime Grimnir here and there. Then you have Haven. I don't think they run Tempest Defender as much. Could be wrong on that.
Not super common.
But maybe Guardian Sun.
Guardian Sun, yeah. But
yeah,
aside from that, that class came in, and
yeah, that's definitely a very good point. Ward is a lot less common. The only big thing is everybody runs Grimner, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
I mean, some of the Grimners drop early game, but definitely some of them come in late game. But even then, a Grimner is not necessarily the most beefy ward. I mean, 3 defense points at the later stages of the game is not the hugest. It definitely can make the difference, but it's not kind of the most beefy ward you could ever imagine. Not kind of like something like a front guard general or something like that. But moving on a little bit, looking forward to today's show, Vindy. Earlier we talked about how you kind of head up Team EXG as well, kind of are kind of the instigating factor of Team EXG, and what other ways do you contribute, and how do you view EXG performing today in this particular Shadowverse Open? Seems like a lot of them make it to the top 8, but I feel like you're shooting for the first place finish. What are your EXG guys doing to make sure they can close out the win here?
So a lot of the times before the Tuesday happens, Tuesday event, we would try to gather and scrim, figure out what's going on with the meta, and utilize the most optimal decks if possible, or tech. So it's either one or other. We've seen, of course, Mana Surge's Noah consistently just, thrashing on everyone at this point. And he's proven it again. He's already in the top, was it 8?
Yeah.
Already? He's already at top 8 for another round. So
no one never dies.
So we say, what is he doing that's right, and what are we doing that isn't right? But we do well in the 3-deck format. So, we're like, you know what? Let's just go with the cookie cutter decks and then just wing it at this point. So yeah, hopefully we get some results and a lot of team kills, but
Yeah, team kills are definitely, I mean, an interesting bit of information. Apparently, EXG out of all the teams holds the most individual players who have earned points over the whole tournament series so far.
That's right. They have 8 players that have earned points so far. Mana Surge, I think, only has 4.
But Mana Surge, off the back of Noah as well as JZ, who won last week, are really holding the lion's share of the points there. For EXG, constant, they're really working at it. They're sending a lot of people into the tournament and trying to make good performances, and we do see them make it to the top 8. Would love to see that one of them make it to the finals here, or 2 of them maybe, and have the team kill happen in the finals. But we'll see about that. I want to, as kind of a last thing here for you, Vindy, why don't you tell us about some of the things coming down the pipeline for you? What are you looking forward to? Is there anything in particular that you can tell us about your tournaments or things that you're looking forward to being able to release?
So several things that, aside from the AXG tournament, there's only about 3 left in this season. And we do, the special thing about the last tournament is that whoever wins it, regardless of seeding points that we do, they are qualified to join in our Grand Championships. That's happening in July 28th, 29th, and 30th. It's a 3-day tournament, and it's basically a format of, it's a big format. 5 decks, 2 bans, and then changing it up to being a 5-deck, 1 ban for the semifinals. And finals, we're contemplating on changing that to just 0 bans or 1 ban, but we'll see what the idea says. But we have some rough drafts around, but we're excited to finish up our year-long
Definitely sounds very
series.
exciting.
Yeah, really looking forward to watching that. Maybe chatting with yourself as well as the other EXG guys to see how they feel about the playoffs coming up for you guys. And of course, the NGE Shadowverse Open will be steaming along as well. So really excited to hear that, Vindy. Is there anything you would like to throw in terms of the shout out before we get prepped for the NGE Shadowverse Open number 7?
I do want to shout out to the organization of the team, such as Dynamite, who's done the website for www.teamexg.com. He's been working hard at it, and I can't thank him enough for creating that website. Also, as well as Aoi Sukiyuri, who's a phenomenal mod, along with Burn and Arcade SL. Some of those people, they're basically the backbone of the tournament series where they kept everything all together and stuff. So I can't thank them enough for it. So yeah.
Great.
Awesome.
Teamwork makes the dream work. So with that, Vindy, we will be taking a short last hiatus before the NGE Shadowverse Open number 7 starts off. I can't wait to see who's made it to the top 8 and who will be the champion of this 7th week. There's only 3 more left. The 7th week. So without further ado, we'll see you guys soon for more NGE Shadowverse